Imagine for a second that everything you think you know, the chair you were sitting in right now, the phone in your hand, the very sky above you, is nothing more than a shadow. A flickering, distorted image cast on a wall. And imagine that if you tried to turn around to see what was casting that shadow, it would hurt. It would physically blind you.
It is a terrifying thought, isn't it?
It is.
To question the fundamental nature of your own reality, I mean, it just shakes the ground you stand on.
It really does. And today, we are not just questioning reality in a sci-fi glitch in the simulation kind of way, although you know we love those topics.
We do.
We are going back to the source, the absolute bedrock of Western philosophy. We're opening up Book 7 of Plato's Republic.
Which is, I mean, arguably the most famous section of one of the most famous books ever written.
Exactly.
Oh.
But here's the thing. Most people, they stop at the cave.
Right. They know the basic story.
They know the story. Prisoners, shadows, fire. We all learned it in Philosophy 101 or, saw a reference to it in a movie. But today we have a different mission. We're going to unpack the cave, yes, but then we're going to go so much further. We're going to look at the syllabus.
That is such a great way to put it, because Book 7 isn't just a story about a cave. It's a rigorous, demanding curriculum designed by Socrates. He is laying out exactly how to take a human mind, strip away all the illusions, and drag it, kicking and screaming, if it has to be, toward the truth.
And let me tell you, kicking and screaming is right. I was reading through this source material, this dialogue between Socrates and Glaucon, and Socrates is not gentle about this process.
No, not at all.
This isn't a fun elective class you take for an easy A. This is boot camp for the soul.
It's the ultimate mental gymnastics. And for you listening right now, I really want you to prepare yourself. This isn't just about how to run a city or how to be a politician.
No.
This is about how to know what is real versus what is merely a puppet show. It asks a central question: how do we distinguish the shadow from the substance?
So let's dive in. We have to start with the visual. The allegory of the cave. Even if you heard it before, we need to really set the scene because the details Socrates gives are wild.
They are.
It's so much more specific than just people in a cave.
They're very specific. Socrates asks Glaucon to imagine an underground den. It has this long entrance open to the light, but way deep inside, there are human beings.
And they have been there since childhood.
And they aren't just sitting there.
No, they're chained.
Yes, fettered by their legs and by their necks. And this is the detail that always chills me. They cannot move their heads.
At all.
They are fixed, staring at the cave wall directly in front of them.
It's horrifying when you actually visualize it. It's not just imprisonment. It's a forced perspective. They have never seen themselves. They've never seen each other. They've only ever seen that one wall.
Correct. And behind them, a little further up on a higher ground, there's a fire blazing. And between that fire and these prisoners, there's a raised walkway with a low wall, kind of like a screen you'd see at a puppet show.
So you have these puppeteers walking along this wall, and they're carrying objects, statues of people, animals made of stone, and wood holding them up so they project over the wall.
Exactly. And the fire, which is behind them, casts the shadows of these objects onto the wall the prisoners are forced to face.
So wait, let's be really clear about this. From the prisoner's perspective, they don't see the fire.
Nope.
They don't see the puppets. They don't see the puppeteers. They only see the shadows.
That is their entire reality. And because the cave echoes when the people carrying the objects speak.
Oh, this is such a key point.
Isn't it? The prisoners assume the sound is coming from the shadows themselves.
So for them, the shadow is the reality. If a shadow of a horse goes by and they hear a sound, they say, that horse is talking.
Yeah.
They name the shadows as if they were real, actual objects.
And Socrates makes this devastating point right here. He says, to them, the truth would be literally nothing but the shadows of the images.
Nothing but the shadows. That is the hook. They are totally convinced. They don't even know they're prisoners. They think this is just life.
And they even build a whole culture around it. They have competitions.
Right. I love this detail. They give each other honors and praises. They have prizes for the guy who can best remember the sequence of the shadows.
Exactly. Oh, look, the shadow of the vase usually comes right after the shadow of the warrior.
And if you can predict that sequence, you're considered the genius of the cave.
You're the smartest guy in the room. You get all the awards.
It's a complete closed system. But then Socrates, he shifts the simulation. He says, okay, what happens if we break the chains? What happens if we liberate one of them? And notice the language he uses. It is not some gentle awakening.
No.
He says the prisoner is compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his neck round and walk and look towards the light.
And it hurts.
It involves sharp pains. The glare distresses him. He literally cannot see the real objects, the wooden statues, the stone figures, because his eyes are just ruined by the light. He's dazzled. This is the part I find so fascinating psychologically. If you told this guy, hey, those shadows you were looking at, they were fake. These wooden statues, these are real, he wouldn't believe you.
He'd think you were completely crazy.
He would.
Think about it from his perspective. The shadows were clear. They were defined. He knew their order. These new objects, they're bright and blurry and painful to look at.
So he would believe the shadows were truer than the objects.
Of course he would, because he can actually see the shadows properly. So his instinct is to run back, to retreat to the darkness where he can see clearly and feel smart again.
But the guide, the teacher, or whoever is freeing him, doesn't let him.
No. Socrates describes him being reluctantly dragged up a steep and rugged ascent. This is the ascent of the soul. It's a struggle. It's not a pleasant walk in the park.
Not at all.
And he's held fast until he's forced right out into the presence of the sun itself.
And now he's totally blind, dazzled. He can't see a single thing.
Not at first. He needs to acclimatize. And Socrates outlines a very specific progression of sight here, which is actually a metaphor for the whole curriculum we'll get to later.
Okay.
He can't just look at the sun. That would be impossible.
Right. First, he can only look at shadows in this upper world. Then, reflections of men and objects in water.
Correct. He's looking at puddles. It's a softer, more manageable version of reality. Then, after that, he can look at the objects themselves, the actual trees, the actual rocks.
And then he looks at the sky, but he has to start at night.
He starts at night. He looks at the moon and the stars. It's still light, but it's not the overwhelming light of the sun.
And finally,
he is able to look at the sun. Not a reflection of the sun in water, but the sun itself in its own proper place. He contemplates it as it is.
And this is the aha moment, the big realization.
It is the ultimate realization. He concludes that this sun is what causes the seasons and the years. It governs everything in the visible world. And it is, in a way, the cause of everything he and his friends used to see down in the cave.
He realizes the fire in the cave was just a cheap, smoky imitation of the sun.
A tiny man-made copy.
And the shadows were imitations of imitations.
Correct. And his feelings toward his former life, they change completely. He remembers his fellow prisoners. He remembers the honors they gave each other, those prizes for guessing which shadow would come next.
And now he looks at those prizes and just, what, laughs?
Yeah.
Or cries?
Probably both. Socrates quotes Homer here, saying he would rather be the poor servant of a poor master, which was basically the lowest form of life in Greek society.
Right, the absolute bottom of the barrel.
He'd rather be that than think as they do and live that life. He would rather endure anything than go back to that false reality.
And here is the tragic twist of the Republic.
Yeah.
He has to go back. Or at least the allegory explores what happens if he does go back.
This is the descent, the return to the cave.
Yeah.
And it is just as disorienting as the ascent was.
Because now his eyes are used to the bright sunlight.
Exactly. Imagine walking from a bright beach into a dark movie theater. You're blind for a moment, right?
Yeah, you can't see anything.
But for him, it's profound. Coming out of the sun and going back into that darkness, his eyes are full of darkness. He's blinking. He is stumbling.
And the prisoners, the ones who have never left, they look at him and they don't see an enlightened master. They see a clumsy idiot.
They say his eyes are ruined. They say, look at him. He went up and he came back broken. Clearly, it's better not to even think of ascending.
And it gets darker. Socrates asks if he tried to free them, to lead them up, and if they could somehow get their hands on him, what would they do?
They would kill him.
They would kill him.
If they could.
Because he is disrupting their reality. That is, well, that's historically heavy, considering what happened to Socrates.
It's a very clear foreshadowing of Socrates' own death. I mean, he was the man trying to drag Athens into the light, questioning their shadows of justice and piety, and they executed him for it.
It really emphasizes the danger of being the one who sees the truth in a world that absolutely loves the lie.
It does.
So let's pause and unpack the symbols here before we move on to the education part. We have the cave, the fire, the ascent, and the sun. What is the decoder ring for this whole thing?
Socrates lays it out quite clearly for Glaucon. The cave is the world of sight, the physical world we see around us with our eyes.
Okay.
The fire inside the cave represents the sun of our physical world.
Okay, so the physical sun, the star in our sky, is just the fire in the cave analogy.
In the analogy, yes. It's the thing that illuminates our physical reality. The ascent, that dragging up the hill, is the soul's journey into the intellectual world.
World of ideas.
The world of ideas. And the sun outside the cave. That represents the idea of the good.
The idea of the good. This is a huge concept in Plato. It's not just good like charity or being a nice person.
No, it's the ultimate reality. It's the parent of light and truth. It is the source of all reason. Socrates says that in the world of knowledge, the idea of the good appears last of all and is seen only with an effort.
But you have to see it.
You have to. It's the power upon which anyone who wants to act rationally must fix their eye.
So if you haven't seen the good, you're just guessing at shadows.
Precisely. You are operating completely in the dark.
Now, this leads to a really interesting problem. Socrates calls it the duty of the philosopher. Because if you make it to the top, if you see the sun, and you're just basking in that intellectual warmth, why on earth would you go back to the sewer?
Why would you?
Why would you leave the world of truth to go back to the world of shadows?
That is the natural question. And Socrates admits that those who attain this beatific vision, as he calls it, are unwilling to descend. Their souls want to dwell in the upper world forever.
Of course they do. They don't want to go argue in courts of law about shadows of justice when they have seen absolute justice itself.
It would be like a physicist having to argue with a flat earther about whether the ground is flat. It's painful.
And they look ridiculous doing it.
They do. Socrates warns us not to laugh at a confused soul until we know why they're confused. He distinguishes between two kinds of blindness.
Right, I like this part. There's blindness from going into the dark.
And blindness from going into the light.
Okay.
Yes. One is the confusion of someone who is overwhelmed by a new, higher truth. That's the blindness of the prisoner first seeing the sun. The other is the confusion of the enlightened person trying to readjust to the darkness of ignorance.
And that second one, that's the blindness of the philosopher returning to the cave.
Exactly.
So Glaucon, who is the guy listening to Socrates, he asks, wait, isn't it unjust to force these happy philosophers back down into the den? Why should they have a worse life when they could have a better one?
And Socrates gives a very startling answer about the nature of the state. He says the goal of the legislator isn't to make one class happy, not even the philosophers.
Right.
The goal is the happiness of the whole state.
It's the collective over the individual.
But there is also a debt to be paid. Socrates argues that in other cities, philosophers might be self-taught. They kind of grow up like weeds, unwanted by the government, so they don't owe anyone anything.
But in this ideal city...
In this city, they have been bred and educated by the state. They are the kings of the hive. They have been better educated than anyone else, so they have a duty to go down.
Go down to the general underground abode.
And here is the payoff. Socrates says, once they get used to the dark again, once their eyes adjust, they will see 10,000 times better than the prisoners.
Why?
Because they know the truth behind the images. They know what the shadows represent because they have seen the real things.
And this leads to what I call the paradox of power. Socrates basically says the only people who should be allowed to rule are the people who don't want to.
It is one of his most enduring political insights. The state in which the rulers are most reluctant to govern is always the best.
That's a powerful line.
It is. If you have people fighting for power thinking that office is some prize or way to get rich, you get civil war and ruin. You need rulers who are rich, but not in gold. Rich in virtue and wisdom.
So how do we build these people? How do we take a human and turn them into this reluctant, all-seeing philosopher-king? This brings us to the curriculum. And Socrates starts by totally refuting the way we usually think about education.
He takes a shot at the professors of education of his day. They claim they can put knowledge into the soul, like putting sight into blind eyes.
Yeah, like you're downloading a file. Here's the knowledge, now you have it.
Socrates says no. That's completely wrong. The capacity for learning is already in the soul.
Okay.
It's like an eye. If an eye is looking at the darkness, you can't just force it to see light. You have to turn the whole body around.
So education isn't adding something new. It's turning the instrument of knowledge around.
Yes, turning the soul from becoming, that changing world of shadows, to being the eternal, unchanging truth.
Okay, so that makes sense. And this leads to a fascinating distinction he makes between virtue and wisdom.
It does. Socrates suggests that virtues like courage or temperance are like bodily qualities. You can implant them by habit and exercise.
Like going to the gym.
Exactly. But wisdom is different. It has a divine element. It never loses its power.
But that power can be used for good or for evil.
Yes. He describes the clever rogue. And we all know this type of person, a paltry soul, but with very keen eyesight. He isn't blind.
No, he's sharp.
He sees the way to his end very clearly. But because his soul is turned the wrong way, his keen vision is forced into the service of evil.
He's mischievous in proportion to his cleverness. A dumb criminal is a nuisance. A brilliant criminal is a catastrophe.
Precisely. So the goal of education is to take that keen vision and turn it around early. Socrates uses a very graphic metaphor here. He talks about the lead weights of sensual pleasures.
Like eating, drinking, gluttony. He says these weights are attached to us at birth.
And they drag the vision of the soul downward. He says we need a circumcision of the soul. We need to trim away these lead weights so the soul can look up at the truth instead of down at the trough.
Okay, so we need to turn the soul. How do we do it? Socrates starts building the syllabus, and he has some pretty strict criteria.
He does. The subjects have to pull the soul from the visible world to the invisible world, from becoming to being.
And he starts by rejecting what they already have.
Yeah.
Gymnastic.
Nope. That deals with the body, which grows and decays. It's all about the changing world.
Music?
No, not really. He says it's about habit and harmony, but not scientific truth.
So what is the first subject? The first step on the ladder out of the case.
Arithmetic. Number and calculation.
Now wait. I can hear people listening right now rolling their eyes. Math? You want to free my soul with math?
Right.
But Socrates isn't talking about doing your taxes here.
No, and he isn't even talking about it for the sake of trade or merchants. He starts with a practical hook war. He jokes that Agamemnon, the great general in the myths, is often portrayed as incompetent because he couldn't count his own feet or organize his troops.
So sure, a warrior needs to count.
Right. It's useful. But that's just the surface.
Yeah.
He then goes into this really trippy argument about three fingers. I want to spend a second on this because it's the key to why math matters so much to Plato.
Okay, let's do it.
It is the core of his cognitive theory. Socrates holds up three fingers. A little finger, a second finger, and a middle finger. He says, look at them. Your eye sees a finger. It doesn't matter if it's in the middle or on the end, white or black, the eye is satisfied.
The eye just reports, that is a finger. It doesn't ask any questions.
Right, it doesn't invite thought. And then he asks about the qualities. Is the finger big or small? Is it hard or soft?
And that's where the eye gets confused.
Yeah.
Because the ring finger is big compared to the pinky, but it's small compared to the middle finger.
Exactly. So the eye is reporting back to the brain. This object is big and small at the same time.
Or if you touch something, it might feel hard compared to a sponge, but soft compared to a rock. The senses are giving you contradictory impressions.
This is hard, and this is soft simultaneously. And the soul goes, whoa, hold on, how can one thing be its opposite?
This is the moment of crisis.
It is. This confusion forces the soul to summon calculation. It has to ask, what is greatness itself? What is smallness itself? What is unity? It forces the mind to separate the visible object from the abstract concept of number.
So the confusion of the senses is the spark that lights the fire of intellect.
Beautifully put. That is it. Arithmetic compels the soul to reason about abstract numbers, numbers that can only be realized in thought, not in visible objects. That is why it is the first step out of the cave.
Okay, so we've got arithmetic, step 2.
Geometry. Plain geometry.
Again, he starts with the military pitch, right? Good for pitching camps.
He does, but he quickly dismisses that. The real value is that geometry aims at the knowledge of the eternal. It isn't about practical things like squaring or extending land boundaries. It's about understanding the properties of shapes that never change, that exist eternally in the realm of truth.
Then he hits a speed bump, he goes to astronomy next, but then he literally stops himself. He says, wait, my bad. I skipped a step.
He did. He forgot solid geometry. Cubes and depth.
And there's a fascinating little historical nugget here. He says the study of solid geometry is undeveloped in his time because the state doesn't honor it, and frankly, it's really hard.
It shows us the state of science in Plato's day. They hadn't fully worked out the mathematics of three-dimensional objects yet. He predicts that if the state were to direct this study, it would emerge into light.
He is basically calling for government funding of advanced mathematics.
Plato, the original advocate for the National Science Foundation.
So once we figure out cubes, then we go to astronomy, the motion of solids.
And this is where he gets into a fight with Glaucon. Glaucon is all excited. He says, oh yes, astronomy, it makes the soul look up. It's very spiritual to look at the stars.
And Socrates just shuts him down.
Completely. He says, no, looking at the ceiling is not looking up with the soul.
It is a hilarious rebuke.
It is. Socrates argues that if you are just staring at the pretty lights in the sky, you are still just looking at visible things. You are still in the cave of sight.
He compares the stars to a diagram drawn by a great artist, like Daedalus. He said, sure, it's beautiful, but a real mathematician wouldn't look at a drawing of a triangle to find the true absolute equal. He would look at the math.
The true astronomy, according to Socrates, is about the true motions and absolute numbers, the mathematical laws that govern the movement. It is about problems, not observation. He wants them to do orbital mechanics, not stargazing.
And then he pairs this with harmonics, the ears instead of the eyes.
And again, he roasts the current experts. He makes fun of musicians who tease and torture the strings, trying to hear the smallest possible interval between notes.
He says they are racking the strings on the pegs like it's a torture device. It's so funny.
He even critiques the Pythagoreans, whom he usually respects. He says they investigate the harmonies they can hear. But the true goal is to understand why some numbers are harmonious and others are not. It's the math of ratio and proportion.
So the whole curriculum, arithmetic, geometry, solids, astronomy, harmonics, it's all one giant arrow pointing toward one thing: abstract truth, away from the senses.
Yes. And Socrates calls all of this the prelude. We haven't even gotten to the main event yet.
The main event, the hymn of dialectic. What is dialectic?
Dialectic is the coping stone. It's the capstone of the entire education. Socrates distinguishes between the mathematician and the dialectician. He says mathematicians can calculate, but they aren't necessarily capable of reasoning.
That's a burn on the math department.
Well, his point is that mathematics relies on hypotheses, on assumptions that they don't question. They assume 1 + 1 = 2, and then they build from there. But dialectic questions the assumptions themselves.
It goes to the root.
It goes to the very first principle. It attempts to grasp absolute being by the light of reason only, without any assistance from the senses. It destroys hypotheses to secure the ground. It lifts the eye of the soul from the, as he calls it, outlandish slough of the material world.
So it's the ability to define the essence of each piece, to strip away the context and say, this is what justice is, this is what good I is in the abstract.
And Socrates sets a very high bar. A dialectician must be able to run the gauntlet of all objections. You have to be able to defend your definition against every single attack, not by appealing to opinion, but by appealing to absolute truth.
And if you can't do that,
you don't know it. You're just dreaming.
Okay, so this is an incredibly rigorous path. Who gets to do this? We can't just let anyone sign up for this program.
No, absolutely not. The selection process is brutal. Socrates lists the traits: surest, bravest, fairest, noble. But also, they need a keenness for learning. He notes that the mind faints sooner than the body in these matters.
The toil is the mind's own. You can't share the load.
Exactly. They need a good memory. They must be an unwearied, solid man, a lover of labor. And crucially, they must hate falsehood.
Not just lying.
No, not just voluntary falsehood. They must hate involuntary falsehood, ignorance. They must hate being wrong.
So here's the timeline. It's a lifetime commitment.
It starts in childhood, but, and this is a very modern pedagogical point, Socrates says early education shouldn't be compulsory.
Instruction through amusement.
Yes. He says knowledge acquired under compulsion obtains no hold on the mind. A freeman ought not to be a slave in the acquisition of knowledge.
So you have to make it a game.
You have to play games with them to see where their natural bent lies.
So they play math games until they're about 20. Then what happens?
At 20, the best are selected. They then spend 10 years integrating all those scattered sciences, seeing how astronomy relates to geometry, how geometry relates to harmonics. It's about getting a comprehensive view.
Then at age 30, the big cut. Selection for dialectic. But Socrates gives this huge warning here. The puppy dog warning.
I love this analogy. He warns against teaching dialectic, this questioning of first principles, to people who are too young. Because what do young people do when they learn how to argue?
They argue for fun. They just tear people apart.
Like puppy dogs, they rejoice in pulling and tearing at all who come near them. They refute everyone, and then they get refuted, and pretty soon they end up believing nothing.
They become lawless.
Yes, and they discredit philosophy in the process.
To explain this deeper, Socrates uses the changeling analogy. Can you walk us through that?
Of course. Imagine a son brought up in a wealthy family, surrounded by flatterers. He honors his parents. He believes they're his parents. But one day, he finds out they aren't his real parents. He's a changeling.
So his entire foundation is shattered.
Right. And in that moment of confusion, who does he listen to? The strict, traditional parents who turned out to be fake? Or the flatterers who are offering him pleasure?
You go to the flatterers every time.
Socrates compares this to our moral upbringing. We are raised with traditional laws, principles of justice and honor that are like parents to us. But then dialectic comes along and questions them. What is justice? Is it just what the law says? And the arguments refute the traditional view.
And if you haven't found the true definition yet, if you haven't found your real parents, you're left with nothing.
You're left in a moral vacuum, so you just follow your desires. You become a lawbreaker.
That is a brilliant analogy.
It is, and that is why dialectic is reserved for those over 30 who have stable characters. They study it intensely for 5 years.
So now they are 35. They've seen the truth. They're philosophers. Are they done? Can they go relax?
Not even close. Now comes the return to the cave. For 15 years, from age 35 to 50, they are sent back down into the den. They have to hold military and civil offices.
They have to get their hands dirty.
They need experience, and they need to be tested against temptation. They need to stand firm when they're pulled in all directions by the real world.
And finally, at age 50.
The survivors, the ones who excelled in everything, in action and in knowledge, they finally get to raise their eyes to the absolute good.
And for the rest of their lives.
They use that vision to order the state. They take turns ruling, not as a privilege, but as a necessary duty. And when they die, they retire to the islands of the blessed.
It is a grand vision. But then, right at the very end, Socrates drops a bombshell on how to actually start this city. Because, let's be honest, trying to implement this in Athens would be a total nightmare.
It's the clean slate solution, and it is arguably the most disturbing part of the entire text. Socrates asks, how do we establish this constitution in the easiest and quickest way?
And he says, send everyone away who is older than 10 years old.
Everyone. Parents, grandparents, teenagers. Banish them to the country. Keep only the children who are under 10.
Talk about a reboot, a hard reset.
He argues that this is the only way to remove the children from the habits of their parents, to raise them purely in the new laws and manners, untainted by the old world.
It's just ruthless efficiency. To build the perfect moral state, you have to commit a massive act of family separation and exile.
It highlights the extreme difficulty, maybe even the impossibility of achieving the ideal. It requires a complete break from history, a complete break from tradition.
So let's step back for a moment. We have unpacked the cave, the math, the dialectic, the philosopher-king. What does this all mean for us sitting here today?
I think it comes back to that very first question. How do we know what is real? Socrates is telling us that our senses are not enough, that the world of opinion, what people say, what we see on the news, the shadows on the wall, is not knowledge.
Knowledge requires effort. A lot of effort. It requires turning the soul. It requires questioning the very things that seem most obvious, like this is a finger or this is justice.
And it reminds us that true leadership isn't about ambition or charisma. It's about vision. It's about having seen the good and feeling the heavy burden of duty to bring that light back down to the cave, even if the prisoners hate you for it.
And even if you look ridiculous, stumbling around in the dark because your eyes are used to the sun.
Precisely. That's part of the job description.
We have covered a lot of ground today, from the chains in the den to the stars in the sky. It is a dense text, but man, does it make you look at a shadow differently.
It certainly does. You can't unsee it.
I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. Socrates suggests that the only way to build a perfect society is to banish everyone over 10 years old, to wipe the slate clean. That implies that our baggage, our history, our habits, our parents' influence is what keeps us chained in the cave. So, does that make the ideal city a utopian dream or a totalitarian nightmare?
Oof.
And more personally, right now, in your own life, are you looking at the stars and doing the math, or are you just staring at the ceiling?
That is the question.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.